The frost came early to the Bitterroot Mountains in the November of 1887. It came without warning the way most things worth fearing do, rolling down from the high peaks before the last of October had even finished its business. It coated the lodgepole pines in a thin layer of crystal that caught the moonlight and threw it back in cold, hard sparks. It sealed the creek beds under a skin of gray ice. It pressed down on the world below with the patient, unhurried weight of something that had been doing this for 10,000 years and intended to keep doing it for 10,000 more. Up on Bitterroot Ridge, in the shadows of the tallest peaks, a log cabin sat against a sheer face of granite like it had grown there. 3 rooms, stone chimney, walls built from timber so thick a man could not wrap both arms around a single log. The roof was steeply pitched to shed snow. The windows were small and deep set and shuttered with planks of cured oak. Whoever had built this place had not built it for beauty. He had built it to last. Inside, on this particular night, a fire burned low in the iron stove. 3 men sat around a table made from a single slab of ponderosa pine, and none of them were speaking. The oldest of the 3, a man named Callum Bowman, had his hands flat on the surface of that table. They were large hands calloused from 1,000 seasons of hard use, scarred across the knuckles from a war that had ended 22 years ago and never entirely left him. Those hands had felled timber. They had dressed game. They had held a rifle in the mud of Chickamauga when Callum was 17 years old and not yet old enough to understand what he was part of. Now those hands were perfectly still. On the table between them sat a leather-bound ledger thick as a Bible and worn at the corners from handling. It was closed. Nobody had opened it since they brought it inside. Nobody seemed particularly eager to be the first. Beside Callum sat his brother Colt, 35 years old, with hair the color of rusted iron and eyes that were usually quick with something approaching humor. Tonight there was nothing quick about him. He sat with his forearms braced against the table edge, looking at the ledger the way a man looks at something he is not entirely sure is not going to move. Across the table sat Jedediah Harrow, 43 years old, a former soldier like Callum, though he had come home from the war with a limp that never went away and a particular stillness behind his dark eyes that had settled in like weather. He was reading nothing. He was looking at nothing. He was simply there in the way that Jedediah was always there, present in the fullest sense of the word, as though his attention occupied a room the same way furniture did. From behind the closed door of the cabin's single sleeping room came the sound of a woman breathing in her sleep. Steady, slow, undisturbed. Callum listened to that sound without moving a muscle. 3 days ago, they had not known her real name. 3 weeks ago, they had not known she existed. And now the ledger sitting between them on that pine slab table carried enough weight to bring a powerful man's entire world down around him, enough weight to follow her up a mountain, enough weight to kill. Callum lifted his eyes from the ledger and looked at his brother. Colt did not look back. Jedediah looked at neither of them. The fire settled in the stove with a soft, collapsing sound, and outside the wind found the eaves of the cabin and pushed against them, testing. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say yet that the silence was not already saying better. The clock turns. It goes backward through 3 weeks of mountain time, back down to the valley, back to the mud-rutted main street of a dying mining town called Garnet, back to the afternoon a stagecoach rolled in from Billings carrying one piece of cargo that nobody on it quite knew how to categorize. Her name was Clara Dennison. That was not, in fact, her name at all, but she had been practicing it for 3 weeks, rehearsing the way it sat on her tongue, the way it felt to answer to it without hesitation, And by the time the stagecoach lurched and groaned to a halt in front of Ezra Fletcher's general store, she could respond to it as naturally as breathing. Clara Dennison, traveling west for employment purposes, no family to speak of, no forwarding address. The two other passengers who had shared the coach from Billings climbed down first. A merchant in a suit that had been expensive once, and a widow in black who moved through the world as though she expected it to inconvenience her. They both stepped around the mud without looking back. Neither of them offered a hand to help the third passenger descend. She did not require it. She stepped down from the coach with the particular careful grace of a large woman who has learned through long practice to move through spaces not designed to accommodate her. She was full-figured and broad-shouldered, with hair the color of old mahogany that she wore pinned tightly under a wool bonnet. Her face was angular beneath the soft fullness of her cheeks, with eyes the green of pine needles in shadow. She was 28 years old, though she looked at this particular moment considerably older than that. Not in the way of sickness or neglect, in the way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. In her left hand, she carried a single carpet bag. She did not set it down. She had not set it down voluntarily since she left Chicago. At the relay station 3 days back, halfway between Billings and Garnet, the coach had stopped to change horses, and she had climbed stiffly down to stretch her legs. On the post of the station's hitching rail, pinned beneath a rusted nail, a piece of paper had caught her eye. She had walked toward it without planning, to the way a person walks towards something that has their name on it, even when they know they should keep moving. The paper was a printed notice, partially weathered at the corners, the ink gone pale in the upper left where rain had gotten to it. What remained was still legible enough. Sought female, approximately 27 to 30 years of age, full figure, brown-red hair. Maybe traveling alone, possibly under an assumed name. Believed to be carrying stolen property of significant value. Reward of $1,000 in gold coin offered for information leading to her whereabouts. Inquiries, Pinkerton National Detective Agency, Chicago, Illinois. No photograph, no name. But the description sat on the page with the specificity of someone who had provided it from direct knowledge. She had read it once. She had walked back to the coach. She had climbed in and sat with her carpet bag pressed between her feet and the opposite bench, and had not said a word for the remaining 3 hours to Garnet. Hargrove had not wasted any time. He never did. Now she stood in the mud of Garnet's main street and looked for what she had been told to look for. 3 men. She found them almost immediately because they were not difficult to find. They were standing together near the hitching rail in front of Fletcher's store, and they were each of them, in his own way, exactly as unmistakable as the letter from the agency had suggested they might be. The first one she saw was Callum Bowman, because Callum Bowman was the kind of man a person saw first, whether they intended to or not. 6 feet 2 inches tall and built along lines that suggested he had been assembled rather than born, with a dark beard raking across his jaw and a pair of eyes so pale a gray they appeared nearly colorless in the flat November light. He wore a coat of worked buckskin over a flannel shirt so thick it could have served as a wall. A Bowie knife rode his left hip with the ease of something that had always been there. He was not watching the stagecoach approach. He was watching the tree line beyond the south end of town with an expression of comprehensive assessment, as though he was cataloging everything between here and the mountains and deciding what, if anything, required his attention. Standing behind him with his thumbs hooked in his belt was a younger man with flame-colored hair, pushed back under a battered felt hat, and an expression somewhere between curiosity and the conscious suppression of something that wanted very much to be a grin. This was Colt Bowman, and even from 30 yards away, something in the set of his shoulders communicated that he was a person who found most situations more interesting than they strictly deserved. The third man was not standing with the other two. He was leaning against the post of Fletcher's porch 10 or 12 paces away, holding an unlit pipe between his teeth and watching the coach with eyes that moved slowly and missed nothing. He was lean in the way a fence rail is lean, with gray threading heavily through the dark hair at his temples, and a stillness about him that had nothing to do with inertia. His left leg was extended at a slight angle away from his body, and when he shifted his weight, she could see in the careful economy of the movement that the leg had been arranged that way, not by choice, but by necessity. Something had happened to it once that had not been entirely correctable. She looked at his eyes and found that he was already looking at hers. He did not look away. Neither did she. After a moment, he gave a single small nod. She returned it. Callum Bowman had by this point turned from the tree line and was walking toward her owner. His steps were measured and unhurried, and he moved through the mud of the street the way a man moves through territory he considers his own by right of familiarity. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her the way she had in a different life seen engineers look at a piece of machinery they were trying to understand. Not dismissive, not appreciative, assessing. "You are the woman from the Whitfield agency," he said. It was not entirely a question. "Clara Dennison," she said. The name arrived without hesitation. She was proud of that. Callum Bowman. He did not extend his hand. He did not remark upon her appearance in any direction. "We need to leave before the light goes. Trail up to the ridge takes 4 hours." Behind him, Colt Bowman had appeared at his brother's shoulder. "Callum sent one letter," he said conversationally, as though resuming a discussion that had been paused momentarily. "One letter to one agency asking for one person to help keep the cabin and cook during trapping season." He paused. "He did not specify that it would be all three of us standing here when she arrived." Callum did not turn around. "Colt." One word. Colt Bowman's mouth closed with the precision of a man who has long since learned to recognize exactly which of his brother's tones carries consequences and which does not. Callum reached for her carpet bag. He reached for it naturally as a man reaches for something that needs carrying without announcement or ceremony. The movement was quick and practical and entirely without menace. She lurched backward. It was not a decision. It was not a thought. It was the body doing what the body had been trained to do over 7 years of education in what an unexpected hand reaching toward her generally meant. Her right shoulder came up. Her weight shifted. The carpet bag swung slightly behind her leg. Callum stopped. His arm came down slowly with a deliberateness that was conscious and careful. He looked at her, and in the gray blue of his eyes, something shifted almost too quickly to catch. It was not offense. It was not confusion. It was recognition, the particular recognition of a man who had learned in conditions she could not imagine to read the difference between a person who had been frightened and a person who had been taught to be afraid. "All right," he said, and his voice was even and flat and entirely without edge. "You carry it." From the porch behind them, the man with the pipe had not moved, but his dark eyes had taken in the whole small drama of that moment, and what he did with it he kept to himself. What she did not know, standing there in the mud of Garnett's Main Street with her carpet bag pressed against her leg, was that Ezra Fletcher, 63 years old proprietor of the general store that stood behind those three men, had come out into his porch during the approach of the coach. and that he had waited until Colt moved forward before stepping close to the man with the pipe, close enough to be heard only by him, and saying in a voice pitched for 2 ears only, "There was somebody in town yesterday, Jed, asking around. Well-dressed man. Silver badge showed it quick." The man with the pipe had not altered his expression in any perceptible way. "What kind of questions?" "Woman, full-figured, brown-red hair, traveling alone out of Billings. Said she might be carrying stolen property." Ezra had paused. "Pinkerton badge, best I could tell." The man they called Jed had taken the unlit pipe from his mouth, looked at it briefly, and put it back. "I appreciate you telling me, Ezra." And that was all. But from that moment forward, as the group assembled itself to ride out of Garnet and up into the mountains, Jedediah Harrow rode in a specific way. He rode at the back of the procession, and he did not look primarily at the trail ahead. He looked at the trail behind. He looked at the tree line. He looked at the places where the road bent and where a man on horseback might wait without being seen. He said nothing of this to anyone. The ride up to Bitterroot Ridge took 4 hours and 20 minutes in the end, because the last section of trail had accumulated a thin sheeting of ice from the night before that required care. Callum rode ahead, choosing the line. Colt rode second, largely succeeding in his evident ambition to hold his considerable store of commentary in reserve. The woman they were calling Clara rode in the middle on a mare named Nell, a gray animal of advanced years and unflappable temperament, whom Callum had chosen for this purpose without explaining his reasoning to anyone. She rode well. Callum noted this early on when the trail angled up through a section of loose shale, and Nell's right foreleg skidded slightly on a patch of iced rock, and the woman above her corrected with a quick, sure pressure on the rein that brought the mare back under her without drama. He had been watching from ahead, half-turned in his saddle, ready to intervene. He saw that he did not need to. He turned back to the trail. Colt managed 40 minutes of silence before his constitution failed him. "You ever been up into the mountains before?" he called back conversationally, because Colt Bowman approached the world conversationally in the same way that water approaches the path of least resistance. "No," she said. "First time can be pretty startling. The altitude mostly makes some people sick. You feel all right?" "I feel fine." "Good. That's good. Some people, first time they get lightheaded. Jed threw up twice when he first came up back in '76, though he'll deny that if you ask him directly." "I heard that," Jedediah said from the rear, without inflection. "I know you did." Cole appeared entirely untroubled by this. He angled back toward the woman riding between them. "So what made you decide to come all the way up here? Agency must have offered you other placements, less remote ones." She appeared to consider the question with more seriousness than it required. "I wanted something remote," she said at last. "How remote?" "Remote enough that what I left behind can't follow easily." Colt opened his mouth and then for once thought better of whatever he'd been preparing to say. He faced forward. From the back of the procession, Jedediah Harrow watched the set of the woman's shoulders as she rode. He watched the way she held herself in the saddle, not stiffly, not with the rigid formality of a person performing composure, but with the particular quality of someone who had over time made careful peace with discomfort and had learned to carry it so continuously that it had simply become posture. He noted all of this the way he noted things, quietly and without announcing that he had done so. The cabin appeared at the end of the last switchback as the sun was dropping behind the far peaks to the west. The sky was doing something extraordinary above the jagged ridgeline, burning in long stripes of deep amber and cold violet that had no business coexisting and yet managed it handsomely. The cabin itself sat against the granite face with smoke rising from its chimney in a thin gray column, and the clearing around it was bordered by the dark mass of lodgepole pine on three sides and by the sheer rock on the fourth. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. Something in her face changed, not dramatically, not in the way of emotions that announce themselves with full orchestration. It was subtle and deep, like a shift in water pressure, like something that had been held rigid for a very long time, allowing itself just fractionally to ease. Her shoulders came down perhaps half an inch. Jedediah Harrow, riding behind her, observed this. He said nothing about it to anyone. Inside the cabin was spare and functional, and built to last in a different way than it was built to impress. The main room held the iron stove, the big pine table, three chairs, a bench along one wall, and a set of shelves carrying provisions organized with the militant neatness of men who have lived without women long enough to develop their own systems and become deeply attached to them. There was a smaller room off the back that held two cots in a cedar storage chest. There was a third space that was barely more than a closet with a single cot wedged against the wall and a small window that looked out at the granite face. "That one is yours," Callum said, indicating the closet room. "Door has a latch on the inside." She looked at the door. She looked at the latch. "There is firewood already stacked in there," he continued, "enough to keep the small stove burning through a cold night. If you need more, knock on the main room wall and someone will bring it." "I won't need to knock," she said. "Maybe not." He looked at her directly for a moment, but the option is there. The first morning she woke before 4 o'clock. She woke from a dream she did not allow herself to remember and lay in the dark for a moment with her heart working harder than the cold justified. Then she got up. She swept the main room's floorboards until they were clean. She mended two flannel shirts from the pile she found folded on the bench, stitching the torn seams with small, precise strokes. She had the oatmeal thick and ready with dried venison and dehydrated onion, worked through it by the time Callum emerged from the back room at 5:30. He looked at the clean floor. He looked at the shirts refolded on the bench. He looked at the pot on the stove. He poured himself coffee from the pot she had also prepared and sat down at the table. He did not thank her. He did not comment. He simply sat with his coffee and looked at nothing in particular, and she sat across from him with the Bible that had belonged to her father open in her lap, and neither of them spoke. 10 minutes passed. She was aware somewhere below conscious thought that she had been counting seconds, running a continuous quiet tally of how long she had been sitting in proximity to a large and powerful man without anything requiring her to flinch. By the end of those 10 minutes, she had stopped counting. She was not sure exactly when she stopped. She noticed the absence of it afterward, the way you notice a sound has stopped that you had adjusted to hearing. Colt emerged at 6 and ate enough for two men and complimented the oatmeal so enthusiastically that she found herself studying him for the trick. She did not find one. He appeared to mean it. The second evening at dinner, he reached across her for the salt dish. His arms swept through her peripheral vision fast and without warning, the way arms do when they belong to someone who has never had a reason to slow them down. She closed her eyes. For perhaps half a second, she went still. When she opened her eyes, Colt was holding the salt dish and looking at her with an expression so thoroughly evacuated of everything that had been there before that she understood with a clarity she had not expected that he had not known. He had simply not known. He had been here long enough in this particular quiet that the possibility of her reaction had not existed in his understanding of the world. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it simply and without elaboration in a way that meant it was true. "It's fine," she said. Her voice was completely steady. But from that dinner forward, Colt Bowman began to announce himself before reaching for anything, before changing his position, before standing up. It was not done with ceremony or ostentatious care. He simply began moving through the shared spaces of the cabin as a person moves when they are aware that their presence has a weight and that the weight matters. Nobody told him to do this. He decided it himself. On the third afternoon, Jedediah set a cup of ginger tea on the corner of the table where she was sitting with her mending. He did not say anything. He did not wait to see what she did with it. He simply placed it there and walked to his chair by the stove. She looked at the cup for a long moment. "How did you know I prefer ginger?" she asked at last. "You sneeze twice when Colt makes the coffee," he said without looking up from the page he was reading. "You don't sneeze when the ginger root is simmering." She absorbed this. "You pay attention to a great many things." Old habit. He turned a page. "In difficult country, the ones who pay attention survive. The ones who don't tend not to." She looked at the side of his face. The lines there, the ones the years and the weather had placed, and the ones that had come from somewhere interior and harder to name. "Is that where you learned it in the war, me?" "Partly." He was quiet for a moment. "Partly from other kinds of difficult country later on." She did not ask what he meant. She picked up the cup of tea. The warmth of it went through both hands. On the fourth day, she noticed that Callum knocked before entering a room she was in. She noticed that he set things down more quietly than a man of his size was required to. She noticed that he moved through the cabin in such a way that she was never surprised by him behind her without warning. She had not asked for any of this. She had said nothing. He had simply seen what was required and done it the way he apparently did most things, without discussion, without ceremony, without expecting acknowledgement. She could not remember in the life she had left anyone doing that. On the fifth afternoon, she was sitting at the table with her mending when Jedediah came and sat across from her. He looked at her hands moving over the fabric for perhaps 2 minutes without speaking. Then, "The fourth finger of your right hand," he said. "It was broken, set without a splint or not set at all. The bone healed crooked." Her hands did not stop moving. "I am clumsy." "No," he said, and his voice carried no judgment and no particular emotion, only the flat weight of observation. "Clumsy people break the index finger or the middle one. Those are the ones that catch things they shouldn't. The ring finger breaks when someone holds a hand and won't let go." She set the mending down. He looked at her directly. His dark eyes were steady and entirely calm. "I wanted you to know," he said, "that there is no hand in this house that will do that. I want you to know that clearly, and I want you to know I mean it in the way that men who have been to war and come back know how to mean things." He stood up. He walked to the door to the outside, opened it, and went out into the thin afternoon cold. Not to go anywhere in particular, just to give her the room. She sat at the table and looked at her right hand, at the fourth finger slightly crooked at the middle joint where the bone had healed alone in the dark without help. She looked at it for a long time without thinking anything in particular. The sixth day brought weather. It came the way mountain weather comes in November on the Bitterroot, which is to say, it came without apology and without preparation time. One moment the sky above the clearing was the pale flat gray of old pewter, and the next the wind came off the high peaks with the force of something that had been waiting for permission and had finally stopped waiting. She was at the creek, 40 yards from the cabin, filling a wooden bucket from the section of the bank where the ice had not yet fully taken when the first gust hit her. It took the wool shawl she had draped over her shoulders and carried it off in the direction of the timberline with complete indifference to her preference in the matter. She went after it. The rocks along the bank were sheeted in black ice where the creek mist had frozen overnight. She knew this. She had been careful of it on the way down. But the shawl was her father's gift, the last thing he had given her before he died, and the wind was taking it fast, and she went after it without the care she should have taken. Her right boot hit the ice on the third stride. She went down hard the way people go down on ice, with no warning and no graceful midpoint between standing and not standing. The breath left her body all at once. The creek bank rose to meet her left side, and she slid 3 feet into the water's edge before she caught herself on a willow root grown into the frozen bank. The cold of the water was not like cold she had experienced before. It was cold that had intent, cold that went immediately through wool and linen and reached the skin with a specificity that felt designed. Her skirts soaked through in seconds. She pulled herself up by the willow root hand over hand and stood on the bank shaking in a way that had nothing to do with choice. She found the shawl caught on a pine branch at the edge of the clearing, retrieved it with hands she could no longer entirely feel, and ran back to the cabin door as the sky opened and the snow began. Colt had been checking a trap line in the timber above the creek. He heard the sound she made when she fell. He reached her at the cabin door, took one look at the state of her, and moved. Inside, with Colt's boots already tracking melt across the floor, she had swept that morning. Callum came from the back room in 3 strides and took the situation in without requiring an explanation. "Get those wet things off." His voice was not harsh. It was the voice of a man who has been in survival situations and knows that the distance between cold and dangerous is shorter than most people understand. "There is a wool blanket on the cot in your room. Wrap yourself in it." Colt put more wood in the stove. "Now." He turned to the cedar chest against the wall and began going through it for something dry and warmer than what she was wearing. She managed the coat herself. Her fingers were not fully responding, but they managed it. She pulled the wet outer dress over her head because it was soaked through, and there was no point being modest about survival. She reached for the blanket on the cot and had it half raised toward her shoulders when the movement pulled at something on her left side, and she made a sound she had not intended to make, a short, involuntary sound of pain. The blanket slipped from her left shoulder. The lantern light in the main room caught what was there on her left side and her back. Callum had turned from the cedar chest with a dry flannel shirt in his hand. He was looking at her now, not in the way a man looks at a woman, in the way a person looks at something that has explained in a single moment a very large number of things that had previously seemed inexplicable. His face did not change its expression in any dramatic way. The change was in his hands. They curled slowly at his sides until they were fists and the knuckles went pale. Colt behind him had turned from the stove. He looked. He turned back to the stove immediately, but his hands on the iron door of it were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. From the doorway of the cabin, Jedediah Harrow stood without moving. The silence in the room was of the kind that has physical weight. The fire in the stove ticked. The wind pushed against the north wall. Outside, the snow was coming down properly, Now the soft, steady sound of it swallowing all other sound in layers. Callum set the flannel shirt down on the table. He walked toward her, and he walked slowly, and every movement he made was announced by the sound of his boots on the floorboards, so that there was no moment of surprise in his approach. When he reached a point still 3 feet from where she stood, he stopped. He lowered himself. He went down on one knee on the rough plank floor, and he stayed there, his massive frame reduced below her eye level, and he looked up at her. She braced for whatever was coming. She had been bracing for something since she arrived. The tightened animal waiting that had become over 7 years, simply the way she held herself in relation to the world. She braced now and waited. "Who did this to you, Maggie?" he said. He did not say Clara. He said Maggie, and she understood immediately that he had not known her real name before that moment, that he had simply known in the way that a man of his particular experience knows things, that Clara Dennison had not been her name for very long. His voice when he said it was low and rough and had lost all the edges that his voice normally carried. It sounded like something from a very long way down. She pulled the blanket up around herself. Her hands were shaking, not entirely from the cold. "I fell," she said, "before I came here, several times. I am not careful enough on stairs." He did not move. He remained on one knee and looked up at her, and his pale gray eyes held something that was not simple anger. It was more complicated than anger. It was the particular look of a man who has seen enough of the world's violence to know exactly what he is looking at, and who is choosing with great deliberateness how to respond to it. "A fall does not make that mark on a shoulder blade," he said quietly. "An accident doesn't follow the line of a thumb along a rib." She did not answer. Colt had not turned back from the stove. Jedediah had not moved from the doorway. Callum stayed on his knee for another long moment. Then he stood slowly, and he walked to the far side of the room and stood with his back to her while she wrapped the blanket properly around herself and pulled on the dry flannel shirt he had brought. "You are in our house," he said to the wall in a voice that was flat and certain and without performance. "On this mountain there is no person who will touch you in a way you have not agreed to. No one here and no one coming here." He paused. "When you are ready to tell us what followed you up that trail, we are here to listen. When you are not ready, we are still here." Another pause. "Either way, you are not going back to wherever it came from." She stood in the dry shirt and the blanket and felt the heat of the stove beginning to work on the cold in her core, and she was shaking, but not only from the cold, and she did not say anything else that night. Later, when the three men had settled into their various positions for sleep, and the cabin was dark, but for the diminished glow behind the stove's iron door, she reached under the mattress of her cot and removed the package she had carried from Chicago, wrapped it in oilcloth and tied twice with rope. She unwrapped it partway in the dark. She did not need to see it. Her fingers found the familiar leather cover of the ledger inside, and she held it for a moment, and then she rewrapped it and worked it carefully into the hiding place she had identified on her first night in this room, a section of flooring near the foot of the cot where one plank had a fraction of give to it, where the nail had worked loose from the joist below. She pressed the package down into the dark space under the boards and fitted the plank back into place. She did not know that Jedediah Harrow was not asleep. He had been awake beside the stove in the main room, lying still with his bad leg extended, when the faint sounds reached him through the gap at the bottom of her door. The careful movement, the soft sound of boards, the stillness that followed, which had the quality of a person who has finished something important and is making sure it is finished correctly. He lay in the dark and did not move, and did not say anything. He added this piece of information to the others he had been accumulating since her arrival, and he thought about what it meant that she had come to them carrying something she feared losing more than she feared anything else. And he thought about the notice Ezra had described at the relay station, a notice that matched her description with the precision of someone who had provided it from intimate knowledge. He did not sleep for some time after that. 1 week passed in this careful, fragile equilibrium. She began to sleep longer than the first 3 hours before waking. She began to eat full portions at meals. She began on the morning of the seventh day to look up from her work and out the window at the mountains and to notice that they were purely and without any particular reason she could have articulated beautiful. Then Callum went down the mountain to resupply at Ezra Fletcher's store. He came back as the light was going amber over the peaks. He came through the cabin door without stopping to knock the snow from his boots. He crossed the room and he set the bar on the door. She was at the stove. She turned when she heard the bar drop. Callum set the supply sack on the table and stood looking at her, and she saw immediately in the way he was holding himself, in the particular arrangement of his stillness, that something had changed in the world outside. "There is a man in Garnet," he said. His voice was level and completely without inflection. "Yesterday and today, well dressed for the territory, carrying a Pinkerton badge, showing it around the saloons in the stage depot." She heard the wooden spoon she had been holding strike the floor. She did not remember letting go of it. "His name is Aldrich Vance," Callum continued, and his gray eyes were steady on hers. "He is asking about a woman, full figure, brown-red hair, traveling alone out of Billings. He says she may be carrying stolen property." He paused for a count of 2. "He is offering $1,200 in gold to anyone who can point him in the right direction." From the corner of the room, Jedediah's voice arrived quietly with the weight of a man who has been thinking for longer than the conversation has been going. "Ezra also told me," he said, "that the man who hired Vance did not specify that the woman should be brought back in any particular condition, only that she should be retrieved, and that what she carries should be returned." The cabin was perfectly quiet except for the wind and the fire. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the barred door and felt in her chest the sensation she had almost in 7 days allowed herself to begin to forget. The sensation of being something that was being hunted. The sensation of having run far enough to believe for a moment that running had been enough. Behind her eyes, very slowly, something shifted. Not defeat, not terror, not the paralyzed variety of it. Something harder than that and quieter. The carpet bag was on the floor of her room. The ledger was under the floorboard near the foot of her cot. And she was standing in a cabin on a mountain in November with 3 men she had known for a week, and the man who had spent 7 years convincing her that she was nothing and no one had just sent a professional after her. She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the notice at the relay station. She thought about what it meant that it had been posted there already 3 days out of Billings, which meant Hargrove had not waited. He had moved immediately the way he always moved when something that belonged to him had gone somewhere without his permission. Then she said, "His name is Reginald Hargrove. He owns the Hargrove Steel Corporation in Chicago. He is my husband, and I can explain everything if you want to hear it." Callum looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair from the table and sat down in it, and he folded his hands on the pine slab surface, and he said, "Tell us." He told it the way a person recounts a sequence of events they have survived rather than a story they are performing for an audience. No embellishment, no appeal for sympathy. The facts arrived in order, and she presented them with the same quiet precision she brought to everything she did in this cabin: the mending, the cooking, the careful management of space around the men who occupied it. She sat at the pine table with her hands folded in her lap, and she talked, and the three men listened. Colt had placed his Colt Peacemaker on the table before she began. He had not done it as a gesture of threat or theater. He had simply set it there between them, gripped toward her barrel, pointed at nothing, and the meaning of the gesture was the meaning of a man sitting forward in his chair at a moment when someone needs to know they are not alone. She did not look at the gun. She looked at the table, and she talked. Her real name was Margaret Whitmore. She had been born in Cincinnati in the year 1859, the only child of Harold Whitmore, a clockmaker of moderate talent and considerable decency, who had believed throughout his life that honesty and careful work would eventually produce something that resembled security. He had been wrong about this, as good men sometimes are, and when he died in the spring of 1879, he left behind a daughter of 20 years, a workshop full of tools, and a debt of $800 that had the character of a wall she could see no way around. Reginald Hargrove had appeared 6 weeks after the funeral, in the way that certain men appear in the proximity of difficulty, drawn to it by instincts that they have learned to dress in the language of generosity. He had known her father professionally. He expressed sorrow at the loss in terms that seemed at the time to reflect actual feeling. He offered, in his words, to help. He proposed marriage 4 months later, and she accepted because she was 20 years old and frightened, and because the world she could see from where she was standing had no door in it that did not require his key. She understood within the first year what she had agreed to. Hargrove did not require a wife. He required a particular kind of silence, arranged in the shape of a woman that could be seated at the end of his dining table when he entertained politicians and business partners, and that would reflect well on him without requiring his actual attention. He was 53 years old and had constructed over the preceding 2 decades a version of himself so thoroughly armored in social respectability that his private behavior had long since ceased to feel to him like behavior at all. It was simply maintenance, the necessary management of his environment. She cataloged what she had lost in the 7 years that followed in the same flat inventory-style voice she had been using throughout. The freedom of movement, the right to an opinion expressed aloud. The name she had been born with subsumed entirely into his. 3 ribs on her left side healed on their own. The fourth finger of her right hand, already mentioned. The hearing in her right ear, partially from a blow in the winter of 1885, that she had told the household physicians was the result of a fall on the back stairs. Colt was on a second circuit of the room by this point, moving in the tight, controlled loop of a man who cannot sit still when something is working inside him that has no outlet. His boots made soft sounds on the swept floor. Callum had not moved at all. Then she told them about the night of October 14th. It had been a Friday evening. Friday evenings were when she brought the household ledger down to the study for Hargrove to review before Saturday's correspondence. The door to the study was ajar. The lamp inside was burning. She was on the stair ledger in both arms when she heard the voices inside, and something in the quality of them, a particular tightness, a note of things past the point of comfortable management, made her slow without deciding to slow and stop outside the door rather than knock. Fletcher Dowd was inside. 56-years-old Pennsylvania coal money, Hargrove's largest business partner in the railway supply operations. She had met him at dinners a dozen times. A broad, red-faced man who sweated freely and laughed loudly, and she had always thought the eyes of someone paying very careful attention behind the social performance. He had apparently been paying very careful attention for some time. The documents Dowd had assembled showed in some detail that Hargrove had been diverting money from the worker compensation funds attached to his railway supply contracts. Not carelessly, not in single large amounts that might attract notice, but systematically over 6 years in the patient accumulated way of a man who understands bookkeeping well enough to know where the shadows are. The total, as Dowd named it, was somewhere in the vicinity of $200,000. Money that had been designated for injured and killed workers and their families. Money that had been signed away from those families by a man whose name on the relevant documents was Reginald Hargrove. Dowd had told him he intended to present this information to the federal authorities on Monday morning. She heard the pause that followed this announcement. She heard in that pause everything she needed to know about what the pause contained. Hargrove picked up the letter opener from his desk. It was silver, a gift from a senator's wife engraved with his initials. She had polished it herself on more than one occasion. He used it to cut Fletcher Dowd's throat. She did not describe this part in detail. She named it plainly and moved past it the way a person moves past the section of a road that collapsed without dwelling on the specific mechanics of the collapse. What she described instead was what happened afterward when she was still standing in the doorway that had been fractionally open, unable to move, unable to make a sound, and Hargrove turned from what he had done and saw her. He had chased her to the stairs. He caught her at the first landing. When she regained consciousness, she was in the coal cellar. The door was locked from the outside. Hargrove had spoken to her through the door in the particular measured voice he used when he was explaining consequences. And what he had explained was that by the following afternoon, she would have suffered a tragic accident involving the third-floor balcony, and that this would be a matter of considerable sadness to all who had known her. She was in the coal cellar for approximately 4 hours before she found the loose iron grate on the coal chute. Working in complete darkness, using her hands and the edge of one shoe as tools, she had worked the grate free of its frame over the course of what she estimated to be 90 minutes. She had crawled through the chute and emerged into the alley behind the house at some time past 1 in the morning. Before she left, she had gone back through the coal chute's access door into the basement, and from the basement to the ground floor study by a back passage she knew the household staff used. She had opened the safe behind the false wall panel behind Hargrove's desk. She knew the combination because he had made her open it for him on 14 separate occasions over the years of their marriage, on the theory that a woman who could be made to feel servile in small ways would remain servile in larger ones. Inside the safe there were several things. She had taken only one: the leather-bound ledger that Hargrove kept separate from his official bookkeeping, the one that recorded the actual numbers behind the official numbers, every payment diverted, every signature falsified, every name of every family that had been denied what had been promised. She had walked to the agency of Mrs. Agnes Whitfield with the ledger inside her coat and the sound of her own heartbeat very loud in her ears. She had used the cash she kept in her sewing box, money she had been accumulating over 4 years, in the particular slow, careful way of someone who does not know exactly when they will need it, but understands clearly that they will. She had bought a new name and a ticket to Montana and a seat on the first coach heading in that direction. The room was quiet when she finished. Colt stopped walking. He stood behind his chair with his hands on the back of it, and he looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "Hargrove," he said. "Reginald Hargrove, Chicago. He supplies rail to the Union Pacific lines. The Wyoming section too. Yes, she said, and the Idaho section, and the Montana runs. Colt nodded very slowly, the way a man nods when something that has been formless for a long time is finally taking a shape he can look at directly. He sat down. He put his forearms on the table and looked at them, and then he looked up again. My father's name was Thomas Bowman, he said. His voice had lost all the easy movement that characterized it normally. What was left was something simpler and heavier. Union Pacific, Wyoming Territory, the 3rd of July, 1879. He went down in a tunnel collapse on the 247th mile of track. They got the timber out. They didn't get him. He paused. The company sent a letter, said the accident was due to personal negligence on the part of the worker, said no compensation was owed. Another pause. My mother wrote to them for 3 years. They never answered. She held his gaze and said nothing for a moment. Then, I will look for his name in the ledger. Colt nodded. He looked back down at his hands. Jedediah had not moved from his chair throughout the telling. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and when she finished and the silence settled in, he looked at the middle distance for 30 full seconds, running calculations that he kept to himself. Then, if the ledger is what you say it is, he said, then Vance is not here to bring you back to Chicago. Hargrove doesn't need you back. What he needs is that ledger destroyed, and the only living witness to what happened in his study on October 14th removed from the equation in a manner that cannot be traced back to him. He paused. Vance was given a contract. We need to understand clearly what that contract covers. Callum stood up. He did not make a speech about it. He walked to the weapons rack beside the door and lifted the Buffalo Sharps rifle from its mount and held it at his side while he looked at his brother and then at Jedediah. Jed? East Trail First Light. His voice had the quality of a man who has moved past considering and arrived at doing. Colt, the creek access needs blocking. I'll do the switchback approaches before dark. He was already moving toward the door. Colt rose from his chair. At the door, he stopped with his back still to the room. He did not turn around when he spoke. Is his name in there, he said. In the ledger, Thomas Bowman, Wyoming, 1879. Is he in there? I don't know yet, she said, but I will look tonight. He went out. The next hours moved with the particular efficiency of men who have converted urgency into activity. Callum worked the switchback trails in the remaining daylight, pressing tin cans and blank shotgun shells into the snow, at intervals rigging the kind of warning system that does not stop anyone but buys time, which in this territory and in the arithmetic of survival amounts to the same thing. He packed the approach snow down around the cabin's perimeter, removing whatever soft cover might allow a man to move quietly in the dark. He checked the shutters on every window and drove additional wooden wedges into the frames to give them another quarter-inch of resistance. Jedediah inside moved the ledger. The loose floorboard near the foot of her cot had served as concealment for a week, but concealment and security are not the same thing, and what was coming up that mountain deserved better than a loose nail. He found a better location in the cavity behind the stone facing of the fireplace, where the mortar between two lower courses had been replaced at some point, with a fitted piece of wood that could be removed and replaced without leaving obvious marks. He relocated the ledger there, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth, and fitted the wooden piece back into the mortar line. She watched him do this. He explained nothing. She asked nothing. In the late afternoon, he sat across from her at the table and set the Smith& Wesson Model 3 between them. "You've never fired a handgun," he said. "No." "I'm going to show you how this works." He turned the revolver so the grip faced her. "Pick it up." She reached for it, and he watched the way she picked it up, and he saw immediately the problem with her fourth finger, and he did not address it as a problem. He adjusted. He shifted his approach to accommodate the hand he was dealing with rather than the hand the instruction was designed for. And when she had the grip properly modified for her particular anatomy, he showed her the mechanics. "You are not going to be asked to shoot accurately at any distance," he told her. "Accuracy at distance requires practice we don't have time for. What you need to do is by 30 seconds. If someone gets through a window or forces the rear door, you point it at the center of their body mass and you pull the trigger and you keep your feet under you. The recoil's going to want to put you off balance. Let your knees bend." She listened carefully and said nothing. "The fourth finger," he said after a moment. "The grip adjustment I showed you compensates for it, but you'll feel it on the second shot if you tighten up. Don't tighten. Let the gun move and bring it back." She practiced the grip several times without firing. "You knew about my finger from the first day," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes. Why didn't you say something sooner?" He looked at her levelly. "Because it wasn't mine to say until you were ready to hear it in the right context." He stood and moved the chair back to its place at the table. "It is yours to say in whatever context you choose. I only needed you to know that I had seen it, and that it changes nothing about how you are regarded in this house." Colt came back in from outside as the last of the light gave way, stomping snow off his boots, his breath clouding. He had reinforced the rear exterior wall with a packed snow berm that would not stop a bullet, but would slow a man's approach and announce his presence in the doing of it. He had done this without his coat, working in the cold, with his sleeves rolled up in the particular way of a man who needs the physical difficulty to be commensurate with what he is feeling. That night, after she had gone to her room, the three men sat at the table. It was Colt who spoke first, which was usual. What he said was less usual. "If we don't resolve this correctly," he said, and his voice was quiet in the way it very rarely was, "she goes back, or worse than back." "Yes," Jedediah said, "then we resolve it correctly." There was a silence. Then Callum said in the flat, straightforward voice he used when he considered that something had been discussed sufficiently, "This is not your obligation. Either of you, what came up that trail came for her, not for us. No one is required to be part of what comes next." Colt looked at his brother across the table. The look he gave him was a look of a man who has known another man for 35 years and occasionally finds him baffling. He stood up, pushed his chair back, and as he passed Callum's chair on the way to the sleeping room, his shoulder made brief contact with Callum's shoulder. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. "Go to sleep, Callum," he said, and went. Jedediah watched the fire for a moment longer. Then he picked up his book, found his page, and said nothing more. The snow fell through the night and into the morning, and it stopped somewhere before dawn and left behind it the particular crystalline silence of a high mountain winter morning, when the air has no motion at all and every sound carries 3 times its normal distance. The trap at Weeping Rock was 2 miles down the western approach. When it fired, the flat crack of the blank shell carried up the canyon walls and into the clearing where Callum was standing outside the cabin door with his coffee, watching the sky. He set the cup on the porch rail. He went inside. "Weeping Rock," he said. 2 miles, moving fast for the snow depth. He took the buffalo sharps from the rack. He looked at Jedediah, who was already standing. Then he looked through the cabin's interior to where she stood in the doorway of her room, fully dressed, the Smith and Wesson at her side. "Stay inside," he said. "Bar the door when we go out. If someone reaches the cabin before we get back to it, you know what to do." "I know what to do," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. He nodded once. Then he went out. From his position on the granite outcropping above the main switchback trail, lying flat on the cold stone, with the sharps braced across a natural shelf of rock, Callum brought the brass spyglass to his eye and found them. 4 men, not 3. Aldrich Vance walked in front, moving with the controlled, measured pace of a man who has been in difficult terrain before and understands that urgency and haste are not the same thing. He was wearing a heavy wool coat trimmed with fur at the collar that had cost more than anything in Garnett's general store, and he wore it without self-consciousness, the way wealthy men wear things, as though the weather had been informed of his preferences and agreed to cooperate. Behind him came 3 men who looked as if they had been collected from exactly the kinds of places where men of that particular description are collected, the saloons and the lower tables of the gambling houses, the kind of men for whom $1,200 in gold is not a windfall but a transformation. The one at the rear of the group was Dale Pruitt. Callum had thrown Pruitt off this mountain 11 months ago for running trap lines through the northern section of the ridge that he had no claim to. He recognized the walk, the particular angle of the man's shoulders, and he understood immediately, with the clarity that mountain country sharpens in a man's thinking, that Pruitt's presence was not coincidental. Pruitt knew this terrain. Pruitt knew the cabin. Pruitt had been purchased specifically for what he knew. Callum settled the sharps. He chose a point in the snow 2 feet in front of Vance's next step and sent the shot there. The .50 caliber round from the Buffalo gun detonated in the frozen ground with a sound that rolled down the canyon like the announcement of something large and inevitable, and the geyser of snow and pulverized rock that came up from the impact point left no ambiguity about what had just happened or where the next one would go. Vance went down into the snow. The 3 men behind him scattered for cover. The echo of the shot was still moving through the valley when Callum's voice followed it. "Last warning, Vance." He did not shout. Mountain acoustics handled the rest. "Turn around. Walk back down. There is nothing on this ridge that belongs to your employer, and there is a cold grave for anyone who wants to argue the point." Below in the snow, behind a deadfall of fallen timber, Aldrich Vance lay still for a moment. Then he rose slowly to one knee, produced a silver flask from his interior coat pocket, and took a careful drink from it. His voice, when it came back up the canyon, carried the particular unhurried precision of a man whose profession requires that he not be rattled by things designed to rattle him. "Mr. Bowman, I am a fully contracted agent of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The woman you are harboring removed property from a private residence in Chicago, Illinois, and fled across state lines. My contract authorizes recovery of both the woman and the property. Your interference in this matter constitutes obstruction under federal statute." Callum ejected the spent brass from the sharps and loaded another round. The sound of the falling block opening and closing carried clearly in the cold air. "She's not going back," he said. There was a pause below. Then Vance made a hand signal to the 3 men behind him that Callum could not see clearly, and the group began to move. They did not move forward on the main trail. They separated. One man angled hard left toward the face of the eastern slope. 2 others went right into the thick timber. Vance himself dropped back behind the deadfall and stayed there. Dale Pruitt was the one going right into the timber, and he was moving quickly and quietly for a large man in deep snow because he knew exactly where he was going. Colt took the eastern slope. He came around the ridge's shoulder from a position above the man climbing up toward him, and his arrival was enough to pin the man down behind a boulder in a frozen standoff that occupied the man's entire attention and capacity. Two shots exchanged at range, neither connecting, both serving the purpose of keeping each man precisely where he was. Jedediah moved through the timberline on the western side of the clearing, with the patience and silence of a man whose bad leg had taught him over 20 years to be economical with everything he had. He did not rush. He tracked the sound of Pruitt moving through the trees, and he placed himself not where Pruitt was, but where Pruitt was going, and Pruitt was going to the cabin. He had told Vance that there was a way onto the roof from the northeast corner where a mature pine grew close enough to allow a man of reasonable agility to make the crossing. He had seen this on his several previous visits to the ridge in the years before Callum had banned him from it. He had kept this piece of information in the back of his mind as useful the way certain men keep pieces of geography in the particular mental file that holds things you might need when circumstances change. He reached the tree. He climbed it with more noise than he would have liked. He made the crossing to the roof. Inside the cabin, she heard him the moment his boots touched the shingles. She heard it because she had been standing in the middle of the room since the men left, holding the Smith & Wesson with two hands and listening to everything. She had been cataloging sounds, sorting the external from the internal, the wind from the wood, the natural settling of the structure from anything that did not belong. Boots on a roof pitched at 40 degrees in November do not sound like wind. He had a short-handled tool of some kind. She heard it working at the chimney cap, the scrape and impact of metal on stone and mortar. Then smoke began to come back down into the room, not the normal trace of it that a wind shift produces, but a steady thickening return of it pushed back by a blocked flue. She recognized the strategy immediately, not because she was familiar with military tactics, but because she was familiar with a particular style of thinking, the style of a man who prefers indirect pressure to direct confrontation, who likes to create conditions that force the other party to make a predictable movement. Hargrove had operated this way in everything he did: create discomfort, control the exits, meet them where they have to be. She was not going to the exit. She went to the stove. The largest pot in the cabin was the cast iron Dutch oven, heavy enough that carrying it with one hand while holding the revolver in the other was impractical. She set the revolver on the table within reach and used both hands to fill the Dutch oven from the water barrel beside the stove and haul it onto the burner. She waited. The smoke thickened. Her eyes stung. She stayed low and she waited with the particular patience of a woman who has spent 7 years learning that patience in difficult situations is not passivity, but survival. When the water was at a rolling boil, she lifted the Dutch oven from the stove. It weighed with the water something in excess of 40 pounds, and her arms registered every one of them. She carried it to the point directly below the chimney opening. She climbed onto the chair she had positioned there. She poured it up the chimney. The sound that came from the roof above her was the sound of a man who has been prepared for many eventualities and has not included this one among them. Dale Pruitt came off the roof the way a man comes off a steeply pitched surface in November, when his grip has been compromised and his balance is gone. He came off fast, and the snow in the yard received him with indifference, and he lay in it without moving in the immediate aftermath. Outside at the main switchback, the geometry of the engagement had changed. Vance had left the deadfall, while Callum's attention had been split between his firing position above and the sounds of the flanking movements Vance had moved. He had come around the west side of the granite outcropping through a route that cost him time, but cost him observation too, and he came up behind Callum's position from an angle that the position had not been designed to defend. He had the Schofield pressed to the back of Callum's head before Callum heard him. "Set the rifle down," Vance said. His breathing was elevated from the climb. His voice was not. "On the ground, slowly." Callum set the sharps down on the snow. "Now call her out," Vance said. "Tell her to bring the ledger. We all go our separate ways and this ends without anyone dying today." Callum said nothing. "I'm going to count to 10, Vance said with the professional evenness of a man who has made this offer before and intends to honor it. After 10, I walk to the cabin and I handle this differently, and the outcome becomes less pleasant for everyone involved. Starting now." He got to 4. The cabin door opened. Vance's attention moved to it, the involuntary flicker of a man who has been waiting for a particular thing and cannot suppress the response when it arrives. It was a fraction of a second. It was enough. Callum did not go for the rifle. The rifle was 3 feet away, and 3 feet in deep snow is a long distance when a gun is already at the back of your skull. He went for the hand holding the gun. He pivoted left and drove his forearm upward against Vance's wrist with the force of his full body weight and the downhill momentum of a man who has spent 2 decades on the side of a mountain and understands how to use gravity as a tool. The Schofield discharged into the sky. The shot went straight up and came back down somewhere in the timber and bothered no one. They went into the snow together. Vance was not a small man, and he was not an inexperienced one. He fought with the focused economy of someone trained to it, going for the eyes with one hand and trying to bring the Schofield back around with the other. Callum caught the wrist with the gun and applied the kind of pressure to it that the joint was not engineered to withstand. The sound it made was not the kind of sound that leaves room for ambiguity. Vance made a noise that was sharp and involuntary. The revolver disappeared into the snow. Callum drove one fist into the side of Vance's jaw. The Pinkerton's head went back and his eyes went to the side. The snow received him the way the snow had received Dale Pruitt minutes earlier, without comment and without complaint. Callum was still on one knee in the blood-spotted snow when the cabin door opened fully and she walked out. She was pale. She was shaking in a way that was partly the cold and partly something the cold had nothing to do with. She held the Smith & Wesson in both hands with the muzzle pointing at the ground, and she had come out because she had seen from the window she had positioned herself beside when she heard the shot that Callum was down on his knee and Vance was on the ground, but she could not be certain of what that meant, and she had come out anyway. She had come out with the gun. Colt emerged from the eastern slope, moving fast, his right hand wrapped in a strip of cloth he had torn from his own shirt, the cloth dark with blood from a knife that had gotten through his guard during the standoff. He took in the scene in the yard quickly and efficiently, the way men who grew up with older brothers who went to war learned to take in scenes quickly. Jedediah came out of the tree line from the west with Pruitt's rifle over his shoulder, and Pruitt himself walking ahead of him, moving with the careful cooperation of a man who has been persuaded by circumstances to be cooperative. She stood in the yard with the gun at her side and the cold coming through her clothes, and Callum rose from the snow and walked toward her, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and he reached out and took the revolver gently from her hand and checked the cylinder and set it safely and then stood there. "You didn't have to come out," he said. His voice was rough from the cold and from something else. "I could see you were down," she said. "I didn't know if you needed time. I had it handled. I know that now." He looked at her for a moment. Around them, the mountain was very quiet, the way it goes quiet after something loud and violent, as if the terrain itself is taking stock. "You bought us the time we needed at the cabin," Jedediah said from behind her. He had a hand on Pruitt's collar and was watching the tree line with the other. "The chimney approach was the one we hadn't covered. You covered it." She looked down at her hands. The right one with the crooked fourth finger was still trembling lightly. She made a fist of it and let it go. That night, after Pruitt and the other two hired men had been secured in the tool shed with their hands bound and their boots removed after Colt's hand had been cleaned and wrapped properly, after the cabin had been searched and resecured, and the fire rebuilt from its embers, Callum sat down across from Aldrich Vance. Vance's right hand was immobilized against his body, with a wrapped length of rawhide, the wrist splinted with two short pieces of firewood. He was sitting in the chair with his back against the wall, and his face had the particular quality of a man who has had his assessment of a situation revised significantly and is integrating the revision. Callum set a cup of water on the floor within his reach and said nothing. Vance looked at the water. He looked at Callum. After a moment, he said, "You should know what you're holding on to. Tell me." "Hargrove has a man inside the U.S. Marshal's office in Boise. Has had for 3 years. If you take the woman and that ledger to Boise, the ledger disappears before it reaches anyone who matters. The woman gets returned in whatever condition Hargrove has specified, and you end up in front of a judge on charges of obstruction and harboring a fugitive in a jurisdiction where the judge has also had professional dealings with your opponent." Vance paused. "That is not speculation. I know the specifics of that arrangement because part of my previous work for Hargrove involved confirming that it was secure." Callum looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" Vance was quiet for a moment. The fire worked in the stove. Outside, the wind moved against the walls. "Because my contract specified recovery," Vance said at last. "Recovery means bringing someone back alive and in condition to stand trial. What Hargrove told me the contract meant and what he explained afterward that it actually meant are different things." He looked at his immobilized hand. "I have done a great many things in this profession that I am not proud of. I have broken strikes. I have testified to things I knew were not accurate. I have intimidated people on behalf of men who did not deserve to have any intimidated on their behalf." He looked up. "I have never killed a woman. That is not a principle I arrived at through moral reasoning. It is simply a line I drew. Hargrove's actual instructions cross it." "Boise is out," Callum said. "What is the alternative?" "Denver," Vance said. "Down, Federal Courthouse 8th District, Judge Silas Creedmoor. He has been sitting in that seat for 22 years, and in that time, Hargrove has made 2 separate attempts to acquire something useful against him and come away from both empty-handed. Creedmoor is the only man in a 300-mile radius of Chicago's reach who cannot be bought, coerced, or reasoned with. If that ledger reaches his desk and the woman stands up in front of him and says what she saw, Hargrove is finished." Vance paused. "I know this because Creedmoor is precisely why Hargrove needed the ledger destroyed rather than simply hidden. He has always known that Creedmoor was the one judge he could not survive." Callum sat with this for a moment. "Denver is further," he said. "Yes. And harder to reach in this weather with prisoners." "Yes." Callum stood. He looked at Vance for a long moment. Then he walked to the door of the cabin, opened it, stood in the cold air. looking out at the clearing and the dark tree line and the stars above the ridge very bright in the cleared winter sky. She had come to the doorway of her room without his hearing her, and he turned to find her there watching him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Denver, we leave at first light." She looked at him. Then she looked through the main room to where the fireplace stood, and behind its stone face wrapped in oilcloth, the ledger waited in the dark. "All right," she said. And she said it in the way of someone who has made a decision they intend to keep. In the pre-dawn hours, while the others slept, she sat at the table alone with a candle and opened the ledger. She turned pages slowly and carefully until she reached the section organized by year and region: Wyoming Territory, 1879. She ran her finger down the columns of names: Thomas Bowman, July 3rd, 1879. Union Pacific Mile, 247, Wyoming Territory. Compensation claim $240. Claim denied. Reason personal negligence of worker. Authorization signature or Hargrove. She looked at the entry for a long time, then she closed the ledger and sat in the dark with her hands flat on its cover until the gray of morning began to show in the narrow gap at the bottom of the shuttered east window. At dawn, when Colt came out pulling on his coat, she was standing at the stove making coffee. She did not look up immediately. When she did, she said, "He is in there, your father, July 3rd, 1879. Colt stopped moving. $240, she said. Denied. Hargrove's signature. Colt stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Then he nodded once in the way of someone receiving confirmation of something they have believed for a long time without being able to prove it. He sat down at the table and poured himself coffee when she put the cup in front of him, and he did not say anything else for several minutes. "Then let's go get this done." They took Vance on the pack mule, hands bound in front of him, feet lashed under the animal's belly. The two hired men in Pruitt they left in the tool shed with a note pinned to the door for Ezra Fletcher at the bottom of the mountain, describing where they were and what they had done and asking him to see to their release once the party had sufficient head start. She took the ledger from behind the fireplace and wrapped it in her saddlebag under two changes of clothes and the Bible with her father's name in it. She looked at the cabin before she rode. She looked at the thick walls and the deep-set windows in the stone chimney from which her steam had driven a man off the roof. She looked at the clearing and the tree line and the peaks above. Jedediah rode up beside her. He looked ahead at the trail. "You'll come back to it," he said. He said it as though it were simply a piece of information, not a reassurance. She turned her horse to the trail and followed Callum down the mountain, and the snow closed behind them, and the cabin sat against its granite face in the winter silence and waited. At his desk in Chicago on that same morning, Reginald Hargrove opened a telegram. He read it once. He set it flat on the desk and pressed his hands against it for a moment, smoothing it as though the physical pressure might change what was written there. Vance had not reported in 72 hours. The ledger had not been recovered. The situation, the telegram's sender noted with careful understatement, appeared to require reconsideration. Hargrove folded his hands. He looked out at Michigan Avenue 4 stories below, where the city moved in its ordinary way, purposeful and indifferent to the difficulties of any particular man. His network was extensive. He had contacts in telegraph offices across 3 states. Men who had been paid over the years for exactly this kind of information. The kind that arrives quietly and early before official channels have processed what they are looking at. He would know which direction they were moving before long. He had always known in the end which direction things were moving. That was how he had built everything he had built. He picked up his pen. He wrote a name on a piece of paper. He rang for his secretary. Denver was a long way from Bitterroot Ridge, but it was the only road left, and they were on it now, all of them together, moving through the winter toward whatever the other end of it held. The descent from Bitterroot Ridge took 12 days. 12 days through country that did not care about their urgency or their cargo or the particular weight of what they were carrying south toward Denver. The mountain gave them nothing for free. It gave them 3 separate snowstorms, one of which pinned them in a shallow rock overhang for the better part of 30 hours, while the wind moved through the canyon below with the sound of something in genuine pain. It gave them a river crossing where the ice had thinned in the middle, and Jedediah's horse went through to the knee, and they spent 2 hours drying the animal's legs by a fire built from green timber that smoked badly and warmed poorly. It gave them altitude sickness for Colt on the 4th day, the kind that makes a man's head feel as though it has been packed with wet sand. And Colt rode that day in silence, so complete that Jedediah remarked once quietly that it was almost restful. They did not go through Garnet. They did not go through any town with a telegraph line for the first 6 days, moving instead along trapline trails and old mining access roads that existed on no official map, and that Callum navigated by a combination of memory and the particular instinct of a man who has spent 12 years learning a piece of country from the inside out. They stopped at night in the places that mountain men stop, shallow caves and dense timber stands, and the leeward sides of granite formations that broke the wind enough to make a fire viable. Aldrich Vance rode on the pack mule without complaint. This surprised her initially, and then it stopped surprising her because she came to understand over the course of those 12 days that Vance was a man who had made his decision and was living in the consequences of it with the same professional composure he brought to everything else. He ate what they ate. He slept when they stopped. When his splinted wrist gave him serious trouble and on the colder nights, he mentioned it once to Jedediah, who adjusted the wrapping without ceremony and without commentary, and Vance thanked him, and that was the end of it. On the 3rd night in the rock overhang with the storm pressing against the opening and the fire burning low, she sat beside Callum while the other 2 men slept. The space was narrow and the warmth required proximity, and neither of them remarked on this. "How long were you building the cabin before you felt like it was permanent?" she asked. She was not sure why she asked it. The question came from somewhere below the level of deliberate thought. He considered it seriously. "3rd winter," he said. "First 2 winters, I was still building it in my head, changing things, thinking I'd done something wrong and needed to redo it." He looked at the fire. "3rd winter, I stopped thinking about it. It was just there, part of the ridge." "And the other 2, when did they come?" "Jed came the year after I finished it. He just arrived one day with a horse and 2 mules and his gear, and he didn't explain why, and I didn't ask." He was quiet for a moment. "Colt came in '82. He'd been in Wyoming for 3 years trying to get some kind of legal resolution on our father's situation. Courts, lawyers, petitions to the state. He spent every dollar he had and didn't get anywhere. He came up the mountain because he needed somewhere to stop moving for a while and think about what came next." "Did he figure it out what came next?" Callum looked at the fire for a long moment. "I think he just did." She absorbed this. Outside, the storm pushed against the rock, and the fire leaned in the draft from the overhang's opening. From where Colt lay sleeping, she could see the even rise and fall of his breathing. "Why did you write to the agency?" she asked. The real reason. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then Jed told me something in the winter of '86. He said a man who lives long enough alone stops being able to remember what he's surviving for. He said the problem with surviving is that it can become the whole thing if you let it, and then you are not living, you are just not dying, and those are not the same. He paused. I thought about that for a year. Then I wrote the letter. She said nothing. The fire settled. From outside, the storm made a sound like something pressing its full weight against the mountain and finding the mountain indifferent. On the fourth night, she told Colt about his father's entry in the ledger. Not the fact of it, which she had already given him, but the specifics, the exact wording of the denial, the column of numbers, the date, the signature in Hargrove's particular narrow hand. She told him because he had not asked again, and she understood that his not asking was not the same as not needing to know, and because she thought he deserved the specific truth rather than the general version of it. He listened without speaking. When she finished, he sat for a long time looking at his hands. $240, he said finally. Yes. My mother wrote to them for 3 years. His voice was entirely even. They never answered a single letter. Not one. He looked up. She died in '84. She died of thinking he just fell and nobody was responsible, and that was just how things were. She was wrong, Maggie said, and the record will say so. Colt nodded slowly. He looked back at his hands. Then he looked up at her with something in his face that was not simple grief and not simple anger, but some compound of both that had been sitting in him for 8 years looking for the right container. Then let's make sure the record says so, he said. On the 8th night, Jedediah asked her the question none of them had asked directly. They were in a shallow ice cave in a hillside above a frozen creek, a natural formation that had sheltered travelers in this country since before any of them were born. Its floor worn smooth by generations of people passing through on their way to somewhere else. Callum and Colt were outside tending the horses. Vance was asleep or appeared to be. After Denver, Jedediah said, "What do you want?" She looked at him. I'm not sure anyone has asked me that directly in a very long time. I'm asking it now. She thought about it with genuine attention, the way she had been learning over the past weeks to think about things that had been prohibited for too long to feel entirely safe to consider. I want to stop looking over my shoulder, she said. I want to sleep a full night. I want to be useful to something that matters. She paused. I want to have a name that belongs to me. You will have all of those things after Denver, he said. I'm asking what you want beyond them. She looked at the ice cave wall and the firelight moving across it. She thought about the cabin on the ridge, the thick walls and the stone chimney, and the particular sound of 3 men occupying a space with the comfortable familiarity of years. She thought about ginger tea left without explanation, about a chair pulled back and a voice saying something before a hand reached across, about a man going down on one knee on a rough plank floor so that he would not be taller than her when he asked a question she was afraid of. She did not say any of this directly. I think, she said, that I know what I want. I'm waiting to see whether it's mine to want. Jedediah looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the fire. Callum built that cabin for 12 years after he finished it, he said, without understanding what he'd built it for. He is in most respects an exceptionally perceptive man. In this particular respect, he is somewhat slower. He picked up the stick he had been using to tend the fire. I am telling you this as a piece of information. What you do with it is yours to decide. She smiled. It was a small thing, and it surprised her somewhat to find it there. Denver arrived on the 12th day. They came down out of the last foothills in the afternoon of a cold, clear day and found the city spread out before them in the particular way of Western cities in that era, a dense central core of brick and commerce, giving way in every direction to streets that were not entirely sure yet what they wanted to be. The air smelled of coal smoke and horses and industry and the distant cold of the mountains they had just come from. She had not seen a city in 6 weeks. The scale of it was briefly disorienting, like emerging from deep water. Callum led them directly to the federal courthouse on Larimer Street without stopping for anything else. He rode as a man rides when he has a destination and a reason, and the others rode behind him in the order they had established over 12 days of mountain travel, and Aldrich Vance rode on the pack mule at the rear with his hands bound and his expression carefully neutral. The federal courthouse for the 8th District was a building of red brick and deliberate authority, 4 stories with a facade that communicated in the language of government architecture that the matters conducted inside it were serious and that the institution conducting them intended to outlast the individuals who appear before it. There were 2 federal marshals at the entrance who took in the arriving party with the measured attention of men whose job required them to take things in without showing what they thought about what they saw. Callum dismounted. He looked at the marshals. He said, "We need to see Judge Creedmoor today. It is a matter of federal jurisdiction involving fraud, murder, and a missing witness." One of the marshals looked at the party. He looked at Vance on the mule. He looked at Callum. Then he went inside. They were shown to the judge's chambers on the 3rd floor. Silas Creedmoor was 62 years old and looked like a man who had been placed behind that desk by geological process rather than appointment. His hair was entirely white, and his eyes were the gray-brown of old Riverstone, and they had the quality of eyes that had spent decades looking at people who were telling them things and learning to read the distance between what was being said and what was true. He looked at the group that entered his chambers with the contained attention of a man who is rarely surprised and has no particular investment in being surprised now. He looked at Callum. He looked at Colt and Jedediah. He looked at Vance, still bound, standing to one side. And then he looked at her, and he held his gaze there the way a man holds his gaze on the part of a situation that contains its essential nature. "Sit down," he said. She sat across from his desk, and she placed the saddlebag on the chair beside her, and she looked at him, and she said, "My name is Margaret Whitmore. My husband is Reginald Hargrove of Chicago. On the night of October 14th, I witnessed him murder a man named Fletcher Dowd in his study with a letter opener. I removed this ledger from his safe before I fled the city. It contains 6 years of records documenting the fraudulent diversion of federally contracted worker compensation funds totaling approximately $200,000. She reached into the saddlebag and placed the leather-bound ledger on his desk. Creedmoor looked at it. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at her. "Why did you come to Denver?" he said. "The nearest federal marshal's office to your point of origin is Boise." "Because Hargrove has a contact inside the Boise office," she said. "We were informed of this by Mr. Vance, who was contracted by Hargrove to recover me and the ledger. Mr. Vance has agreed to provide testimony regarding the terms of his contract and what those terms specified about my condition upon return." Creedmoor looked at Vance. Vance met his gaze evenly. "That is accurate, Your Honor." Creedmoor reached for the ledger. He opened it. He read the way a man reads when he is reading seriously, without movement, without expression, with complete attention. The room was quiet for a long time. From outside the courthouse windows came the muffled sound of the city going about its business. He turned pages. He stopped at a section. He read longer there. He turned more pages. He had been reading for 20 minutes when the door to the chambers opened. She knew before she looked. She knew from the quality of the pause that preceded the sound, from the particular texture of a silence that changes when a room acquires something dangerous. Hargrove's network of telegraph contacts had done what she had understood somewhere in the back of her mind during the long journey that it might eventually do. They had tracked movement through the towns the party had unavoidably passed through in the final days of the journey south, and someone had put together enough pieces to know the direction, and Hargrove had moved. He always moved. That had never changed. Reginald Hargrove walked into the judge's chambers of the federal 8th District Courthouse in Denver, Colorado, in a suit of black wool so precisely fitted and maintained that it constituted in its own way an argument. He was accompanied by two attorneys whose briefcases communicated that they had expected to be here. Behind them, a deputy carrying the badge of the Denver City Constabulary's office looked slightly uncertain about his role in the proceedings. Hargrove surveyed the room. He was a man of 53 who wore his age the way he wore his suit, as a thing managed rather than experienced. His eyes moved from Vance to the three men standing along the wall, to the chair where she sat, and to the ledger open on Creedmoor's desk. The order in which they moved communicated to anyone watching carefully what he considered important. "Margaret," he said. His voice was precisely calibrated. It contained warmth and concern in the exact proportions that a voice contains such things when warmth and concern are not their source. "You look exhausted. I've been worried." She did not look at him. She looked at the ledger on Creedmoor's desk. One of the attorneys stepped forward. "Your Honor, we have a court order from the Cook County Circuit Court in Chicago authorizing the return of Mrs. Hargrove to her husband's custody pending a competency evaluation. She has been in a fragile mental state and was taken advantage of by parties unknown, who convinced her to remove private property from the family residence." Creedmoor looked at the attorney over the tops of the documents he was still holding. He looked at this attorney the way the courthouse steps looked at rain. "This is a federal proceeding," Creedmoor said. "A Cook County circuit order has no jurisdiction in my chambers. Sit down or leave." The attorney did not sit down, but he stopped talking. Hargrove had not moved from the doorway. His eyes were on the ledger. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he has understood in the space of a single breath to be his undoing. "Margaret." His voice had changed. The calibration was gone from it. What was left was something that had always been underneath, something she had heard in various registers over 7 years, mostly in closed rooms, occasionally at the bottom of a staircase. "You need to think very carefully about what you are doing." She turned to look at him. It was the first time she had looked directly at him since she had crawled out of the coal chute in the alley behind his house in the dark of an October night. She looked at him the way she had learned over 12 days on a mountain trail to look at things she needed to see clearly. She looked at him for what he was, a powerful man in an expensive suit who had spent 20 years believing that his power made him the permanent author of other people's realities, and who had just walked into a room where that belief was no longer operative. She said, "The ledger on that desk contains the record of 847 compensation claims denied between 1881 and 1887 under your signature. It contains the account numbers of 3 private financial institutions in which the diverted funds were deposited. It contains notes in your handwriting about the specific adjustments made to the official bookkeeping to conceal the diversion." She paused. and I am prepared to testify in this court. In any court, this judge directs me to about what I saw in your study on the night of October 14th. I will describe where I was standing. I will describe what I heard before I saw it. I will describe what you used. I will describe what you said to me when you found me in the doorway. The room was completely quiet. Hargrove looked at her. In his eyes, for the first time in 7 years, she saw something she had not seen before, had not believed she would see. It was not remorse. It was not guilt. It was fear, genuine and unmanaged, the fear of a man who has operated for decades behind walls he considered impenetrable and has just discovered that the walls are down. He opened his mouth. Creedmoor said, "Deputy, place Mr. Hargrove under federal detention pending arraignment on charges of murder in the first degree and fraud against the United States government. He will be held without bail." The deputy looked briefly at the attorneys, found no useful guidance there, and did his job. Hargrove said nothing more. He looked at her once as the deputy moved him toward the door. She held his gaze. She did not look away. He was gone. The room seemed to exhale. Colt, standing against the wall beside his brother, made a sound that was not quite a word. Jedediah put a hand briefly on his shoulder and then removed it. Creedmoor looked down at the ledger again. He turned several more pages. He stopped at one. He looked up at Colt. "Is Thomas Bowman a relation of yours?" Colt cleared his throat. "My father, Your Honor." Creedmoor looked at the entry. He looked at Colt. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has seen a great many things and knows what they mean. He closed the ledger with both hands. "This evidence will be formally entered into the record of the federal proceeding," he said. "I will be telegraphing the Attorney General's office in Washington this evening. There will be a full accounting." He looked at her. "Miss Whitmore, you have our thanks, and something considerably more practical will follow." 3 days later, the telegram arrived from Washington. The Hargrove estate in Chicago had been searched by federal marshals. The physical evidence recovered there corroborated the ledger in specific and detailed ways that eliminated any remaining ambiguity about its authenticity. Hargrove's two attorneys, understanding which way the institutional wind was blowing, had provided information about the Cook County connections in exchange for considerations that were above Creedmoor's jurisdictional level, but that Washington had apparently found it practical to extend. Aldrich Vance, in a separate proceeding, had formally agreed to testify against his former employer in exchange for a reduced sentence on the obstruction charges. He had provided a written statement about the specific terms of his contract, including the language that had made it clear that Maggie's return in any condition was acceptable, and this statement was the kind of document that made prosecutors grateful and defense attorneys quiet. Creedmoor called her to his office on the morning of the fourth day. He set a document on the desk in front of her. It was 1 page dense with the formal language of federal legal process, and at the bottom it bore his signature and the seal of the 8th District Federal Court. "Your marriage to Reginald Hargrove has been annulled," he said, "on the grounds of fraud and sustained abuse. This document restores your legal identity as Margaret Whitmore, that being the name under which you were born." He looked at her over the document. "Additionally, the federal government is prepared to offer a recovery award for your role in bringing this evidence to light. The amount is $3,000 to be dispersed through this office." She looked at the document, at the name at the top of it, Margaret Whitmore. Her father had given her that name in a small hospital in Cincinnati in the winter of 1859. And she had carried it for 21 years, and then it had been taken the way Hargrove took things, quietly and completely, and without asking. And now it was back on a piece of paper with a federal seal on it, and she was 38 days removed from a coal chute in an alley in Chicago, and the name belonged to her again. She did not cry. She had done her crying in private in the dark of the overhang with the storm outside in the small hours of several nights on the trail when the others were asleep. What she felt now was something past crying, something that had the quality of a physical sensation, rather than an emotional one like the moment when a joint that has been pressed out of alignment for a very long time finally returns to where it was built to be. She picked up the document. She folded it carefully. She placed it in the interior pocket of her coat against her chest. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in the specific way that people mean things when they have had cause to understand what those things are worth. That evening, Creedmoor's office communicated that the formal charges against Hargrove were first-degree murder and federal fraud totaling a sum the indictment described with characteristic understatement as substantial. The trial would be scheduled for the spring term. The outcome, Creedmoor's clerk noted with the particular phrasing of a man who works in federal courts and has developed a calibrated relationship with certainty, was considered highly probable in the government's favor. She stood on the steps of the courthouse in the late afternoon light and breathed cold Denver air and felt the weight of the ledger no longer in her hands. The three men were at the bottom of the steps. Colt was talking to the horses in the particular earnest way he talked to things that could not answer him, which was, she had come to understand, not so different from the way he talked to people. Jedediah was reading something, a folded newspaper he had acquired from somewhere, standing still in the foot traffic of the courthouse steps, as though foot traffic were weather and he had decided to wait it out. Callum was looking at the mountains. Denver sat at the edge of the plains where the land rose toward the Rockies, and from the courthouse steps on a clear day, the Front Range was visible in the west, the peaks running north and south in a line that had the character of something that had always been there and did not particularly care about the city that had grown up at its base. He was looking at them the way a man looks at home when he can see it from a distance but is not yet there. She went down the steps. She stood beside him and looked at the same range of mountains. The light was coming off the snow on the peaks in a way that made them look as though they were lit from inside amber and rose in the low sun. "Creedmoor says the trial will be in spring," she said. "They may want me to testify, say. You'll come back down for it." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I have the recovery award, $3,000. She paused. "I could go a great many places with $3,000. He did not say anything to this. He kept looking at the mountains. "California," she said. "Ohio, any number of cities." Still nothing. "New York, perhaps." He turned and looked at her. The pale gray of his eyes caught the light from the mountains and held it, and what was in them was the same thing that had been there when he had gone down on one knee on a rough plank floor in a smoke-hazed cabin and asked a question in a voice she had not known men were capable of using. It was the specific look of someone who has something to say and is undertaking with considerable effort to say it. "The cabin," he said. He stopped. He looked at the mountains again and then back at her. "I built that cabin for 3 years, lived in it for 12 more. It is the only place since the war where I have slept without hearing things that were not there." He stopped again. "When you came, it stopped being quiet in the way a place is quiet when nothing lives in it and started being quiet in the way a place is quiet when it is full and settled." She looked at him. "I am not a man who understands things easily," he said. "You have had considerable evidence of that. But I am also a man who has spent enough time in country that does not forgive mistakes to understand when something is worth being direct about. He looked at her steadily. I am asking if you want to come home. She was quiet for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, because the answer was large enough that she wanted to hold it for a moment before she gave it the way you hold a piece of warmth in your hands before you share it. I don't want California, she said. I don't want Ohio or New York or any city that has a distance between it and that ridge. She reached up and placed her hand against his chest palm, flat the hand with the crooked fourth finger. I want the cabin. I want Jedediah's ginger tea and Colt's stories about bears that get larger every time he tells them. I want to be useful to something that matters and to know that what I built is mine to stay in. She paused. And I want the man who got down on his knee so he would not be taller than me when he asked me something. He looked down at her hand on his chest. He placed his own hand over it carefully with the deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered to him, and the warmth of it went through her coat and through her palm and settled somewhere it intended to stay. It is a hard life, he said, not as a warning, as a fact that he required her to have, and that he was not willing to soften into something less than it was. I know what hard is, she said. I know the difference between hard and wrong, and the cabin on the ridge is the first place I have been in 7 years where nothing was wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Then from somewhere in the region of his chest came a sound that she had not heard from him before, low and genuine, and entirely unguarded, the laugh of a man who has been relieved of something he had been carrying for a long time without noticing how heavy it was. He closed his hand around hers. Behind them at the bottom of the courthouse steps, Colt had apparently reached the end of whatever he had been saying to the horses and was now looking at his brother and the woman standing beside him with an expression of uncomplicated satisfaction. Jedediah had lowered his newspaper. He looked at the scene before him with the particular look of a man who has watched something develop over time and is content to see it arrive at the place he thought it was going. He raised the newspaper back up. They rode north out of Denver the next morning, not back through Garnet, not through any of the towns where Hargrove's name had weight or his money had fingers. They took the high road through the foothills and turned east at the first pass, and the mountains came up around them like old company, and the air thinned and cooled and began to smell of pine and elevation and the particular cleanness that exists above the altitude where people generally choose to live. Vance rode with them as far as the foothills. Creedmoor had arranged his transport to the federal holding facility, and the federal marshal who came to collect him was professional and uncommunicative, and shook Callum's hand before he left, which was not required and seemed to be a matter of private judgment. Vance, before he went, looked at her. For what it is worth, he said, I am glad it came out the way it did. She looked at him. He was a man who had done a great many things she could not excuse, and one thing she could, and the one thing sat in a different place from the others and required a different accounting. I believe you, she said, and she did. He went with the marshal and the group of 4 reduced to 3 and continued north and up into country that became more itself with every mile. The spring came to Bitterroot Ridge the way it always came, apologetically at first, then with increasing conviction. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes in late March and had pulled back from the clearing entirely by the middle of April, leaving behind mud the color of old iron that dried in the May sun into something that could almost be called solid ground. The creek below the cabin ran loud and fast with the snow melt, and the sound of it filled the mornings in a way that was different from the winter sound of the mountain, less austere, more interested in the business of the present. She stood on the cabin's porch in the early morning of a day in the first week of April, 1888, wearing a skirt the color of spruce needles and one of Callum's flannel shirts belted at the waist, her hair loose in the morning air. The peaks above the ridge still held their snow and would for another 2 months, but the clearing was clear, and the pine trees around it were showing the first pale green of new growth at the tips of their branches. In her hand was a letter from Judge Creedmoor's office. The trial of Reginald Hargrove in the federal 8th District had concluded on the 14th of March. The jury had deliberated for 4 hours and returned verdicts of guilty on all counts. Murder in the first degree, federal fraud, the conspiracy charges that the prosecution had added in January when additional evidence emerged regarding Hargrove's arrangements with the Boise Marshal's office. The sentencing had followed 3 days later. Hargrove would spend the remainder of his life in Leavenworth. The judge at sentencing had noted in his formal remarks that the duration of the sentence was intended to reflect not merely the crimes charged, but the breadth of the harm inflicted on hundreds of families over many years. The letter also contained in its final paragraph a note that a first disbursement of compensation funds had been authorized for 41 families in Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana, to be followed by additional disbursements as the asset recovery proceedings concluded. The letter listed the families in an appendix. The first name on the list was Thomas Bowman, Wyoming Territory, 1879. She had read the letter once, standing here in the early morning before the others were up. Then she had folded it carefully and held it in both hands and looked at the mountains. And she had stayed that way for a long time, not thinking about anything in particular, just breathing the cold, clean air and feeling the weight of the piece of paper in her hands. From the side yard came the rhythmic sound of Colt splitting wood. She had given him the letter the night before. She had sat beside him at the table after dinner with Callum across from them and Jedediah at his chair by the fire, and she had unfolded the appendix and placed it in front of him and put her finger on the first line. He had read it without speaking. He had folded the paper back along its original creases with the same methodical care he brought to things when his hands needed to be occupied so that the rest of him could manage. Then he had stood up, picked up his coffee, walked to the door, and gone outside. He had come back in after 20 minutes. He had sat back down. He had looked at her and said, "Thank you for finding that." She had said it was always there. It just needed to reach the right hands. He had nodded. He had finished his coffee. He had gone to bed. And this morning he was out in the side yard splitting wood with a focused, sustained energy that had about it the quality of something being paid forward of work done not merely because it needed doing, but because the body requires an outlet for things that have nowhere else to go. From inside the cabin came the sound of Jedediah moving the particular cadence of a man who moves carefully in the morning, who gives his left leg a moment to remember what it is doing before he asks too much of it. She heard the stove being opened and the clank of iron on iron and the sound of the coffee beginning its work. She heard boots on the floor behind her. Callum came to stand beside her on the porch. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one without asking whether she wanted it because she always wanted it in the mornings, and he had known this for months. He stood beside her and looked at the peaks the way he looked at them in the mornings, with the long, patient attention of a man who has been looking at the same view for many years and has not run out of things to notice. "The letter from Creedmoor came," she said. "I know. Jed told me." She had shown Jedediah the letter the previous evening too while Colt was outside. He had read it entirely, both pages and the appendix, and handed it back to her without comment. Then he had picked up his book and turned to his page, and after a moment he had said without looking up, "Good." "The trial is finished," she said to Callum. "The verdict was what we expected." Yes. She turned to look at the mountains. The sun was high enough now to be working on the snow at the lower elevations, and she could hear if she was quiet and listened for it, the thin, distant sound of water beginning its long movement down toward the valley below, everything moving, everything working its way towards something else. She thought about a coal chute in the dark, about a woman crawling through it with a ledger inside her coat and nowhere clear to go, about a stagecoach out of Billings and two strangers sharing a seat who looked at her without looking at her, about a notice pinned to a post at a relay station that had told her without any ambiguity how much time she did not have, about a man who went to one knee on a rough plank floor and asked a question in a voice she had not known was possible, about 12 days on a mountain trail and 30 hours in a rock overhang while a storm made its argument outside in a courthouse room in Denver that smelled of coal smoke in old paper and the particular dry seriousness of a place where records are kept and do not disappear, about the name on the document in her coat pocket that belonged to her again. Inside, Jedediah had settled into his chair. Through the open door, she could see him with his book, one hand wrapped around his coffee cup, his bad leg extended at its customary angle. He was, as he usually was in the mornings, entirely present and entirely at rest, and the two things in him were not in conflict. In the side yard, Colt's axe rose and fell in its steady rhythm. She could see him through the gap between the cabin's wall and the tree line, working through the pile of unsplit timber with the focused application of a man who has somewhere to be and knows it but is in no hurry because the somewhere is here. Callum drank his coffee. She drank hers. After a while, he said, "I need to check the north trap line this afternoon. If you wanted to come, the trail is passable." "I'll come," she said. He nodded. He turned and went inside to see about breakfast, moving through the door of the cabin with the easy familiarity of a man moving through a space that is completely his, or is his in the sense that matters, which is not ownership, but the particular deep belonging of a life built in a place over time. She stayed on the porch a moment longer. The mountains were doing what they always did in the early morning in April when the winter had officially lost the argument. They were being exactly what they were: enormous and permanent and indifferent to the difficulties of anyone in particular, and also somehow in that indifference steadying. They had been here before she arrived. They would be here after everything she had carried up them and everything she had carried down them had been resolved into history. She was not afraid of them. She had not been afraid of them since the first morning she woke in the cabin and looked out the small window and saw the peaks above the ridge in the early light and understood in the way you understand things that do not require argument that she was in the right place. Margaret Whitmore set her coffee cup on the porch rail and went inside. She put water on to boil. She opened the flour tin and the salt box and began the work of the morning. The good, straightforward work of feeding people who needed feeding in a cabin on a mountain in April, with the sound of the creek running below and the axe swinging in the yard, and the fire doing its reliable work in the iron stove, and the world outside the thick log walls going on in its enormous and untroubled way. She was not hiding. She was not running. She was not waiting for a hand to come from somewhere she had not expected it. She was home.